Bible Effectively series. And yes, once again, apologies for our lateness. Thank you for bearing with us. So just a quick review of week 2 to start off with. So last time you will have discussed the fact that the Old Testament is as important to read as the New Testament. The division between the Old Testament and the New Testament is in some ways understandable. There's a sort of a big gap of history in between. The New Testament has to do with sort of the new covenant, which came about through Jesus Christ. And, you know, they were written in different languages, as we're going to discuss tonight. But the Old Testament and the New Testament should all be considered together as divine revelation from God and equally important. They are the scriptures all taken together. We considered some tips on reading the Bible. So here's some of the things that were discussed. You need to allow time to read the Bible. It's not something that you can sort of, I don't know, it's not something you can understand quickly. Some sections of the Bible in particular take a lot of time to properly comprehend. You need to give yourself sufficient time to digest those. You know, make yourself comfortable, find a nice, relaxed environment without distractions so you can read. Ask yourself questions and ask questions of the Bible. Note them down. Be patient because the answers won't always come quickly. There are some questions about the Bible that people spend many years or perhaps even their whole lives trying to answer. And focus on what you know. Try and have that positive mind frame. All of us, and this is a very important thing to remember, all of us on the Zoom tonight are students of the Bible, and we are all learning. And we're all learning more about the Bible. So we each need to, I guess, be positive about where we're up to with that and what we've learned already, rather than just getting, feeling overwhelmed by what we don't know yet, because there's always more to learn. And you also discussed prophecy and the fact that prophecy provides believers with hope and understanding. And that's another really positive message from the Bible. So, this is week 3. We're going to start off by looking at some study tools. We're going to consider critics of the Bible and whether there's any legitimacy to some of the criticisms that have been made of the Bible. We're going to look at some Bible words, some specific vocabulary that is pertinent to the Bible. And we're going to look at using cross-references as a way of reading the Bible. So let's start off with study tools. So the reason study tools are important is that, as we've discussed in previous weeks, the Bible is a very special text. It's, for starters, it's basically a library of 66 books written over a huge span of time by lots of different people in lots of different places and containing lots of different genres. And so it's no surprise that it's not always the easiest book to read. And so, in order to do it more effectively, we might want to use some study tools. So I'm going to introduce a couple of those tonight. So here's a bit of a list of some of the tools that you can use to study the Bible. It can be as simple as just looking at different versions of the Bible. That's, I guess, without even going into things outside of the Bible, just the version you're reading of it can be very helpful and it can be very useful to compare different versions. I might throw it over to you for a minute. What are some different versions of the Bible that you've heard of?
New King James, New American Version. I think there's lots. I've seen lots out there.
Oh yeah, there's tons. Yep, the New King James Version is the one that we use for the seminars in particular. But yes, you're right, John, the New American Standard Version, I think. Yeah, there's a couple of them that involve American. Any others that people have heard of?
New International Version.
Yep, the NIV, the New International Version, is very popular. Well, I guess if we've got the New King James Version being mentioned, that makes sense that there's also an Old King James Version. We're going to be sort of talking a little bit about that tonight. But yeah, there's many different versions of the Bible. One that I particularly like is the ESV, the English Standard Version. The New English Translation is another one that I use from time to time. Yeah, there's lots of different versions of the Bible that take different approaches to translating certain things and can be helpful to compare to get a fuller understanding. You can also use concordances and lexicons. We're going to talk about those tonight. Bible dictionaries can be very helpful, and commentaries as well can be useful, particularly for those very complicated and sort of mysterious sections of the Bible that seem a bit unclear. A commentary can really help with those. But tonight we're going to mainly be focusing on concordances and lexicons. So, the main reason that you need a concordance or a lexicon is because the Bible is not written in English, or at least it wasn't originally. There's actually multiple languages in the Bible. So firstly, the Old Testament. Does anyone know what language the Old Testament was written in?
Hebrew.
Yeah, Hebrew. And indeed, to this day, in the Jewish community, the Bible is not called, or rather the Old Testament, as we would call it, is not called the Old Testament. They call it the Hebrew Bible. And yeah, it's written in Hebrew, and part of it is written in Chaldean, which is sort of a related Semitic language. I think it's only the book of Daniel from memory that's partly in Chaldean. And the New Testament was written in what? Greek, absolutely. At the time that the New Testament was written, Greek was, I guess, the international language. It was the standard. Anything worth writing was written in Greek. So for the purposes of spreading the gospel, it made sense to record it in Greek. So concordances and lexicons, they help us to deal with the fact that the Bible was originally written in languages that the vast majority of us can't read. I know that we have got some Greek-speaking people on our Zoom, so I'll only speak for myself. I can't read or speak Hebrew or Greek, but I can use a concordance or a lexicon. So you use a concordance for finding words. It's basically an alphabetical index of words in the Bible. So say, for instance, I was wanting to find a Bible verse that had the word dove in it. I could look up the word dove under D, and it would show me all of the verses that have that word in it. And a lexicon is for finding the meaning of words. And it's basically like a dictionary. So it's words and definitions. So the purpose of a concordance, as I was kind of alluding to with my example there, is that it's useful when you're trying to find a Bible verse. If you are ever trying to find a verse, say for instance, I was looking for a verse where the Spirit of God descended like a dove upon Jesus. I could look up the word dove because that's probably the rarest word in that verse, and that would help me to find it. In fact, these days, probably even more useful in a concordance is just typing it into Google, typing in whatever wording you're most familiar with, and usually something will come up. I find that can be a bit quicker sometimes than using a concordance. However, what a concordance is useful for that Google isn't necessarily useful for is word studies. So you can look at not only a specific occurrence of a word, but all the different ways that it's been used in different places. So I did a big study on the word spirit last year, and I'll actually touch a little bit on that tonight. And I looked at all the different ways the word spirit had been used in the Bible. Some recommended concordances are Strong's Exhaustive Concordance. Here's a paper copy, which, perhaps it'd be more appropriately called Strong's Exhausting Concordance. It's really hefty. It says in the front cover here that this is the exhaustive concordance of the Bible, showing every word of the text of the Common English Version of the canonical books and every occurrence of each word in regular order, together with a comparative concordance of the authorized and revised versions, including the American variations. So this is, really substantial. These days, you can actually get it on your computer, which is a bit more convenient. Another good one is Young's Analytical Concordance. Has a slightly different approach in how it orders things. And there are computer versions, as I said. One that I love to use, which I'll actually show you tonight, is eSword. That's a great free program you can download. And Bible Gateway is a great website that has hundreds of different versions of the Bible, and it's all searchable as well. If you want to be a bit more fancy, you could get the Logos Bible software. That's a pretty expensive but very substantial software package that has all kinds of fancy different things you can do with looking at different versions of the Bible and different source texts, and yeah, very fancy. I don't actually use it myself, but I know people who do. So that's concordances. Lexicons. So the main use of a lexicon is looking up definitions of those Hebrew and Greek words, and it gives you insights into how else a word is translated. So some recommendations would be, again, Strong's has a lexicon at the back. So Strong's is basically a concordance in its first half and then a lexicon in the second half. Genesius and Thayer both did lexicons, which can be give you other translations, and Young did one as well. So let's have a look at an example. This is all sounding a bit sort of technical and abstract to you. Let's see if we can find a concrete example that is helpful. So as I said, last year I did a bit of a study on the word spirit, and I wanted to look at how that word is used in the Bible. So for starters, let's look at it this way. So for starters, in the Old Testament, the main Hebrew word for spirit is ruach, and that's in Strong's lexicon is H7307. So H for Hebrew, and it's the 7,307th entry in the lexicon. So that's what that word is and where it occurs. It occurs 379 times in the King James Version, because Strong's Concordance is based on the King James Version of the Bible. And of those 379 times, 227 times is it translated spirit. So that's the main way that it's translated, but it can also be translated wind or breath or mind. And then there's a few more obscure ones there as well. So what this really shows is that, as in English, words can have different meanings depending on the context. And why this is really important when we're looking at concordances is that I've seen people kind of misuse concordances more particularly lexicons in the past. So the trick is that sometimes people will, want to find out, what's the original Hebrew word for that there. They might look it up and look it up in the background, the back of the Strong's Concordance, and look at the lexicon definition, and they'll see that there's a few different ways you can translate that word. The problem is that sometimes people then fall into the trap of picking and choosing which meaning they want. The problem is that the meaning is determined by the context. Let me give you an English example. So for instance, if you picked up a book and you open it up and you saw the sentence, Billy was the coolest kid in school. So being a speaker of English, that when it says cool there, it means that Billy was sort of hip and trendy and popular. That's the meaning of cool in that sentence. You wouldn't apply the other meaning of cool, which is cold. The sentence is not saying Billy was the coldest kid in school. It's saying that he was, hip, trendy, and popular. In the same way, you can't just pick and choose which definition you want to use in a Bible verse. It has to be determined by context. So let's have a look at how this works with spirit. Just reminding you that there's a few different ways we can translate that, as we can see there. From Strong's Concordance. So what I'll do now is I'll share my screen and show you. So this is eSword, very powerful little program, and very nice in that it's free as well. So what we've got is all the books of the Bible on the left-hand side of the screen here. We've got for each of those books. So I've currently got Psalm selected, got all of the chapters there. So I'm in Psalm 51. And I've come down in the middle window here, which is the actual verses. I've scrolled down to Psalm 51, verse 11. And actually, I'll click over to the King James Version tab. So I've got all my different Bibles along the top here. I've got a few. Some of them I'll never use. For instance, this one's in Latin, which I just sort of downloaded because it sounded interesting. But King James Version, that's the standard that it comes with. So here's the verses I want us to look at. Psalm 51 verses 10 to 12. So this is a very famous psalm. It's a prayer of David asking for forgiveness from God. So David says to God, "Create in me a clean heart, O God, and renew a right spirit within me. Cast me not away from thy presence, and take not thy Holy Spirit from me. Restore unto me the joy of thy salvation, and uphold me with thy free spirit." So each of these verses uses the word spirit. And without going into all the details of this, I'll suggest to you that in the Old Testament, the word spirit often has to do with the idea of motivation. So it can be God's power that he uses, God's spirit, which certainly does motivate things in the sense of it gives them energy and life, but it can also be a human spirit, whether that's, a good spirit or a bad spirit in terms of what motivates them, what energizes them. So David wants a right spirit in him. He doesn't want God to take away his spirit from him. And God's spirit is holy. God's spirit is separate. And he wants God to uphold him with his free spirit. Now that's a bit of an interesting wording, isn't it? Free spirit. I wonder what that means. Well, the first thing I can do to find out is I can try a different version or translation. So let's come across to the ESV. It says, "Restore to me the joy of your salvation and uphold me with a willing spirit." So instead of free, they've used the word willing. That's interesting. That's a bit of a different translation. If I come across to some other versions, like the NIV, it says, a willing spirit again. The NET, which is a bit more abstract, says, "Sustain me by giving me the desire to obey." So that's the word spirit there, I guess, the desire, the motivation, right? And a willing or obedient spirit. So that's how it can be useful to look at different versions of the Bible. So now I understand that, in the context here, David's done the wrong thing. He wants to do the right thing. He wants to have a willing spirit like he used to. Interestingly enough, if I come across to the Message, which is kind of like a paraphrase of the Bible, where it doesn't actually, it's not a translation so much as a rewording. It says, "Bring me back from grey exile, put a fresh wind in my sails." That's a really interesting wording, because as we saw, the word spirit can also be translated wind. So that's an interesting little spin on things they've done in the Message. So I'll come back to the King James Version, free spirit. The other thing that I can do, which is really cool with eSword, is I can click on KJV Plus, which is the King James Version with Strong's numbers. So now you can see all of these words have a little code next to them. And those codes are the original Hebrew words from Strong's Concordance. So instead of me having to, look up all of the words in the concordance and then flip to the back to the lexicon and find them, I can actually just do it all with a single click here, which is very handy. So spirit, as we said, is that word ruach, which is to do with the wind or breath. And it's, it occurs in each of these verses. So a right spirit, a right ruach, Holy Spirit, holy ruach, and free spirit, free ruach. So that's how that word is being used there. Now I want to look quickly at a different place. I want to have a look in the book of Ecclesiastes, because that'll show us how this word can be used differently in different contexts. So if I jump across to Ecclesiastes, and I want to go to chapter 1, and let's just jump to the regular King James Version. Let's scroll down to verse 14, Ecclesiastes 1, verse 14. So Solomon, who wrote the Ecclesiastes, says, "I've seen all the works that are done under the sun, and behold, all is vanity and vexation of spirit." So that's interesting. That's some very old-fashioned and slightly dense language there. I know that vanity means sort of pointlessness, but vexation of spirit, that's, really kind of confusing. I wonder what that means. Now let's try flipping over to, let's firstly just confirm for ourselves that is the word ruach. So go to King James Version Plus, and yes, it is. It's that H7307, same word. In different versions though, what do they say? ESV says, "All is vanity and a striving after the wind." So just checking that we're all following along okay. Which word in this version of Ecclesiastes 1 verse 14 is ruach.
Wind.
Yeah, wind. So instead of spirit, they've translated it wind here. Let's have a look at another version. What's the NET say? Everything he has accomplished is futile, like chasing the wind. Ah, that's interesting. Now I think I get the point. So this is, and this is actually an expression that we have in English. You know, if someone's doing something pointless, it's like chasing the wind or trying to grab hold of the wind. It's something that you can't do. You can't catch the wind. You can't hold the wind. So that's kind of how it's being used here. So it's not really the idea of spirit so much as just a literal wind. Let's have another look at another one. So Ecclesiastes 3 and verse 19. So it says here, for that which befalleth the sons of men befalleth beasts. Even one thing befalleth them. As the one dies, so dieth the other. Yea, they all have one breath, so that a man hath no preeminence above a beast, for all is vanity. So again, the sort of early modern English is a bit dense here, but the point is, the same thing happens to humans as does animals. We all die, we all have breath in our bodies, and when we die, that breath goes away. So here, which word do you think ruach has been translated to?
Breath.
Yes, exactly. So if I click across to KJV Plus and hover over breath there, indeed it is ruach. So there's a different use of that word. So they could have written spirit, but they chose not to because in the context, breath made more sense. And then if I go to our last example at the very end of the book of Ecclesiastes, which is in Ecclesiastes 12 and verse 7, it's talking about when people die. It says, then shall the dust return to the earth as it was, and the spirit shall return unto God who gave it. So there's again that word ruach for spirit. So that's what they've translated here. But I would suggest there's actually a better way to translate that rather than using the word spirit. I think it would make more sense to put that as breath. And indeed, one version does translate it that way. The NET says, the life's breath returns to God who gave it. And that makes a bit more sense to me because that's the way the Bible describes the creation of human beings by God. So if we go all the way back to Genesis 2 verse 7, we won't click there now because I want to stay on this verse, but it says that God breathed into Adam's nostrils the breath of life. Now that's actually a different Hebrew word in case you want to follow it up. It's not ruach, but that's the way the Bible describes it, that he breathed into Adam's nostrils the breath of life. And so when we look at this verse here, it makes sense for that to say, and the breath shall return unto God who gave it. So there's just a little example, actually a few examples of how the word spirit can be translated and how the context helps us to understand that. And also a little insight into eSword as a handy Bible tool. So yeah, I would recommend anyone who hasn't got that to download it and have a play around with it. It is free. You do have to pay for some of the Bibles, but it does come with the King James Version and the KJV Plus. So that's plenty to start playing around with.
All right. Hi, everyone. And introducing myself, I'm Dan. And yeah, we're going to talk briefly about critics of the Bible. It's, you know, I'm mindful that we've got time is of essence tonight, so I'm going to crank through this reasonably quickly. So right. So of course the Bible, you know, is one of those things that people like to make fun of. You know, and we've got Noah here wondering what about the two termites that he's brought along, or the whales. Or even Adam and Eve, and Adam saying, Eve, you're the only one for me. And I mean, while it is, I mean, all of that's true. It's a bit of fun. It's really that people do end up making a bit of fun of the Bible, mainly because they really don't think that it all happened the way that the Bible says it did. And the critics that make their claims, they broadly fall into 4 groups. There's the thought that the Bible is a work of fiction, that is, it's all just made up stories, maybe good morals, but it's all like fables with a moral behind it, or that the Bible isn't inspired, that somehow it all just happened by coincidence, or that it was written so long ago that it's now sort of somewhat irrelevant and can't be relied upon, and some critics do claim that the Bible makes contradictions of itself, and so therefore it can't be relied on. So they're sort of the 4 main groups of criticism. And I just want to have a brief look at each of those. And there's some ways in which we can confirm that the Bible is true, and it does. It actually happened the way that the Bible said. One of those is through archaeology, and we're going to look at that in more detail next week. So we'll hold off on talking about archaeology, but it's it really fascinating, some of the stuff that's been unearthed that verifies what's actually happened. So coming to a prophecy that was shared last week, the prophecy of Daniel chapter 2. And the image that was given or dreamt of by Nebuchadnezzar, and it's recorded there in Daniel chapter 2. Now, it's easy that we can, and we already looked at this, to prove that the nations that were prophesied that would follow from Babylon through the Persians, the Greeks, and the Romans all happened exactly as they were prophesied in Daniel's record. Even though that prophecy was given 500 years before it all happened. So that's interesting that we can actually use some of the Bible to verify itself by looking at those sorts of prophecies. What about Israel? Is it all a coincidence? We can see that way back in the time of Moses, that it was prophesied that they were going to be overthrown by a foreign power, and that the cities were going to be destroyed by siege warfare, and that the Jewish nation would be scattered. Now that was prophesied in Deuteronomy chapter 28, which you can see there on your screen, and and that actually happened 1500 years later. And it's well documented in history, the siege of the Romans. And interestingly, you can see there in the verse, it talks about swift as the eagle flies, and it's the Romans actually used the eagle as their standard. So just an interesting link there. But it wasn't until about 2,000 years later that all of these things actually happened, and you could sort of go on to talk about that in the sense that Jesus did, foretell that of this siege at his time, and then and he says, when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then you know its desolation is near. It comes from Luke chapter 21, and 40 years later, the Romans came along and overturned the nation, and that's fulfilling that prophecy that was given. And you would wonder, well, is that the end for the nation? But in actual fact, the Jews, in spite of the fact that they were scattered at that point for over 1900 years, they have survived, and that was prophesied by the prophet Jeremiah. It says, as you can see, they're highlighted, yet I will not make a complete end of you. So it's not that they weren't going to be wiped out altogether. And interestingly, Jesus, God himself says that he uses or is using the nation of Israel as an evidence of his existence. The very fact that they exist, God says, that's evidence to you that I am in existence. And the nation was actually regathered just as it was prophesied, and they're in their land again, as prophesied by Ezekiel, and they're now over 8 million in the land of Israel, and the immigration continues. So they're now as in a nation as of May 1948, and have Jerusalem again as their capital. So very, very much fulfilling the prophecies that were made, that they were going to be taken captive into all the nations, and that Jerusalem was going to be trampled down by the Gentiles, in other words, the non-Jewish people, until the times of the Gentiles will be fulfilled, and that is the time and the era in which we now are. Okay, so that's really interesting evidence, if you like, and prophecies that were made thousands of years ago that have all come to pass. What about the fact that some say that the text is unreliable? Well, do you know that there's more of the original manuscript surviving than for any other ancient historical document? They're and when we look at manuscripts, old manuscripts, it's really the time between the original when it was written and the piece of document that you've got that sort of dictates how closely it would match, and and the time elapsed between the writing of the original scriptures and the age of the oldest copies is shorter than any other ancient historical document. And there's lots of historical documents that we can look at, and we don't question that they were not genuine. Things like these sorts of ones, the Iliad of Homer, or Tacitus, or the histories of Herodotus, or the works of Josephus, looking at the history of the Jews. Those sorts of texts, people do not question the genuineness of those writings, and yet when you look at this in comparison, you can say, for example, the gospel records, the date of writing sometime between 55 and 70 AD, and the earliest fragments at around 200 AD, means that they are less than 200 years between the actual fragments of the writing and the date of writing, compared to those books that we just looked at, which range from anything above 500 to even 1,300 years between the actual writing and the earliest fragments that are available. So that's just gives you a sense of how much more reliable the documents can be. And in fact, and you've probably heard of the Dead Sea Scrolls, where a shepherd boy discovered a lot of fragments of Bible books that have been hidden by the Jews to stop the Romans destroying them, and this was a really interesting find, because when they made a comparison between the Bible record and these documents, which are even older than the oldest ones that were available prior to that, and there was effectively no major difference. So it does give us confidence that it was faithfully transcribed and recorded and handed down, with this sort of almost semi-independent verification that came along in 1947. So that's in regard to the unreliability, or supposed so. What about contradictions? Here's a comparison. People would perhaps make a criticism that the records of the Gospels all look slightly different. For example, Matthew records that on the cross of Jesus it was recorded, "This is Jesus, the King of the Jews," Mark says it was written the King of the Jews. Luke says this is the King of the Jews. And John says this Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews. So none of the, sort of the critics would say, oh, well, you can't even get your story straight. They're all different. But, it's what I would point out, I suppose, is that, when you've got an eyewitness account, that you don't necessarily get every eyewitness recording exactly the same words. They all record it from their own point of view, and in fact, it's actually a verification of the genuineness that that they actually have got their independent view or recording of the events, and they can be pulled together to give a much clearer picture of what's going on. And they all give a consistent message. And interestingly, by the way, that the Luke record says that it was recorded in Greek and Latin and Hebrew. So they could have been, it doesn't say which one they were actually writing down in terms of, which language they were copying. But, if all of them are giving a pretty consistent message, and in fact, it probably all boils down to, this is Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews. And that could have been what it actually said, which is, and all of them would have been right if that's the case. They're just extracting bits out of it. So that's a quick run through of some of the criticisms that are made of the Bible and some responses. So I'm going to hand back to Matt now, and he's going to talk about some Bible words.
All right. And actually, before I jump into this section, something just to add to sort of corroborate and back up what Dan was saying there is that even this year, I saw an article published in the New York Times, and it followed it up in many other publications. Even just this year, they found more fragments of the Bible, more ancient fragments of the Bible in Qumran in Israel, which is where the Dead Sea Scrolls were found. So they're still finding more ancient fragments. So it really does go to show that this is an incredibly well-preserved and trustworthy text. So let's look at some of the words in that text, some Bible words. So we're going to look at all of these words tonight. Actually, we're not going to look at capital God/God tonight. I think we're going to look at that in a future class. But all the rest of these we will look at because these are all, important bits of vocabulary that it's worth understanding in order to fully appreciate the Bible. So firstly, Lord. And here we're talking about Lord spelled in all caps, capital L-O-R-D. So this occurs in the Old Testament, and it's a translation of the Hebrew name of God. And actually, to be honest, it's not really a translation, it's just a replacement, because the word that occurs in the original texts doesn't mean Lord. So it's the Hebrew letters YHWH. So in Hebrew, particularly in ancient Hebrew, there are no vowels. The writer is just expected to sort of know from the consonants what the word was. And usually, if you're fluent in reading this and you understand the context of what's being said, that'd be pretty easy to work out. So the consonants there are YHWH, and the best reconstruction we have of how that would have been pronounced is Yahweh. So that is the name of God as revealed by God in the Old Testament. The reason in our modern Bibles that's replaced with Lord in capitals is essentially a legacy left to us by the Jews over countless centuries. They developed such a superstitious approach to the commandment that you should not take the name of God in vain that they simply refused to write and to speak the name of God. So in particular, if they were reading, they would never say Yahweh. They would actually say Hashem, which means the name. So instead of saying the name of God, they would just say the name. Even actually these days, for many Orthodox Jews, if they're writing God, the English word God, they'll put a dash instead of an O, so it'll be G-D. And that's, really shows the degree of superstition to which they go to not misuse the name of God. For us, for the rest of us, I believe we can confidently use the name of God. It's recorded for a reason, and it's a beautiful name that tells us a lot about God's character, so it's worth speaking. So it's the most common name for the Hebrew God. It's used more than 6,800 times in the Bible, obviously all in the Old Testament. And as I said, it's typically concealed from the modern reader for reasons basically of tradition and superstition. Most standard translations will render it as Lord or the Lord. But what is actually there is the name Yahweh. There are some versions of the Bible, fairly rare, but some versions that will print Yahweh. I think there's one called the Names of God translation of the Bible that does that. It's also related to the name Jehovah, which is obviously used by the Jehovah's Witnesses in particular. Their Bible will say Jehovah in those spots. I won't go into exactly why I think that's not correct at the moment, but yeah, I would say that's not quite a correct translation of the name of God. It's similar, but the actual name of God we can be pretty confident is Yahweh. Now, what it means, which is really important, is that it basically means he who will be. And it's God's memorial name. So the reason it's called God's memorial name is that he gave it to particularly the Israelites, to his special people, as a memorial, as a special name that they were to pass down through their generations, and by which they were to address God and to think about God and to understand God. And the meaning is he who will be, which sounds a bit sort of vague and mysterious. It basically means that God is revealed through others. He is shown through others. And that's really powerful. There's an immense, you could talk for hours about how powerful that is, that God is actually interested in showing himself through others, through us, in fact. He wants his character to be shown through us and our behavior and our interactions with others. So Yahweh means he who will be. Here's an example from Exodus 3, verse 15. God said to Moses, "Say to the Israelites, Yahweh, the God of your fathers," which is written as the Lord in the English Bible there, the New King James Version, I believe. Yahweh, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob, has sent me to you. This is my name forever, the name by which I am to be remembered from generation to generation. So that's why it's called his memorial name. And in fact, Moses had asked God, because God had said, go to Pharaoh and go to the Israelites and tell them that they are free. And Moses said, well, who should I say sent me? And so he says that it was Yahweh, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Now, what you'll also find, perhaps a little confusingly in the Old Testament, is Lord with a capital L, but the remainder of the letters in lowercase. So in the Old Testament, this is a translation of the Hebrew word Adonai, and it also occurs in the New Testament. In the New Testament, it's a translation of the Greek word Kyrios, like the tennis player, I guess. And in both cases, it means master. So it can be applied to God, or it can be applied to a human master. So there's instances in the Bible of where it is referring to God or to Jesus, or it could just be to a king or a ruler, or even just a master of a household. Your boss, you could refer to as Adonai or Kyrios. So it's a term of respect, I guess, in that sense. Here's an example in the New Testament from 1 Peter chapter 1. Praise be to the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ. In his great mercy, he has given us new birth into a living hope through the resurrection of Jesus Christ from the dead. So there, Jesus Christ is referred to as Kyrios, Lord. So let's have a look at the name of Jesus now. So Jesus is a New Testament word. it's a Greek form of the Hebrew name Joshua. So over time, that Hebrew name, and that in fact, Joshua is not quite the Hebrew name. Joshua is the anglicized or English version. The Hebrew name is more like Yahshua or Yehoshua. And through the translation, I guess, into Greek, that gradually formed into Jesus or Jesus in the original Greek. And the meaning of that name Joshua or Jesus is Yah or Yahweh, so God. Yahweh is salvation, which is, of course, an appropriate name for Jesus, isn't it? Because Jesus is the way that God saves us. So Yahweh is salvation. And here's an example of Jesus' name used in that context. In Matthew 1:21, Gabriel speaks to Mary and he says, or rather, no, he's not speaking to Mary here, but anyway, says, she will bring forth a son and you shall call his name Jesus, for he will save his people from their sins. So there the name Jesus is linked with its definition. He will save, God will save his people from their sins. Oops. And the other important part of the way we address Jesus, so I guess Jesus or Joshua is his Christian name, for want of a better description. That's his actual name. Christ is not actually so much a name as a title. It's actually the Greek equivalent of the Hebrew word Messiah, or Mashiach, as it is in the original. And it means anointed. So both Christ, Christos, and Messiah both mean anointed. And here's a usage in Matthew 16. Simon Peter answered and said, you are the Christ, the Messiah, the anointed one, the Son of the living God. And it's kind of important to remember that Christ means Messiah, because as I was sort of saying right at the start of the class, it shows that the New Testament is very much linked to the Old Testament. It is a fulfillment. It is the fulfillment of the Old Testament. So, Jesus didn't just, pop up out of nowhere with, I guess, no qualifications. The people who followed Jesus, his disciples, like Peter, recognized that he was the Messiah that had been promised in the Old Testament. To this day, Jews still believe they are waiting for the Messiah. And we believe that Messiah has come and that is Jesus. So that's what the word Christ means. It means Messiah. Here's a couple more important words. So a resurrection, firstly, simply means a rising from the dead. A very important Bible concept, which we'll probably talk about in future weeks. For if we have been united together in the likeness of his death, certainly we shall also be in the likeness of his resurrection. So just as Jesus died and was risen from the dead, so we in baptism here sort of die and rise again. We'll talk to you more about that in future weeks. Faith is another really important concept in the Bible. That means a belief or a trust. In fact, there's a really beautiful definition given in the Bible in Hebrews 11, verse 1. It says, now faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. So there, faith is described as kind of like the bridge between what we can see and what we can't see. It's the link between us and the unseen. So for instance, we have to have faith that God exists because we can't physically see God. So that's what faith means. It's an incredibly important concept in the Bible. Holy means set apart, sacred, or separate. So for instance, the Holy Bible is a separate book, it's sacred. And here's a use in the Old Testament. Say to all the congregation of the children of Israel, say to them, you shall be holy, for I, the Lord your God, am holy. So the Israelites needed to be set apart and sacred and separate. They were a special people because God is set apart and special. The Israelites weren't to be like the other people around them, like the other nations, the other cultures and religions. They were to be different, sacred and separate. Gospel is another really good word to be familiar with. This means glad tidings or good news. So in the Greek, text of the New Testament, and I don't quite know how to pronounce this word, but it's like euangelion. In Latin, it's evangelion. And the word gospel, the English word, is actually a really sort of beautifully simple word. It's put together from two Old English words, which is God spell, which means good news. So that's a very literal translation of that Greek word in the New Testament. Here's an example. Matthew 4, Jesus went about all Galilee, teaching in their synagogues and preaching the gospel of the kingdom and healing all manner of sickness and all manner of disease among the people. There's a really nice definition of the gospel as well in Acts chapter 8, which says that it is the good news concerning the kingdom of God and the name of Jesus Christ. And that's a really good way to think of it, that what we have to tell people about God and Jesus and the kingdom of God, that's good news. That's something that can save people. That's something that can change lives. That's, in contrast to so much of the bad stuff that we hear about in the world today, all the bad news items and horror stories. The gospel is good news and something worth sharing. So I'll pass back to Dan to finish up our section tonight on using cross-references.
Thanks, Matt. And yes, so cross-references, what are they? They're not this. They're not people being cross. They're actually the verse references supplied by the translators, and they're all the way through the Bible. There are all these links. We talked before about echoes, like things that sound like something else somewhere else in the Bible, and that happens everywhere. And it's no surprise, of course, that's by God's design. He's actually built it such that there's these linking pieces all the way through, and these are effectively cross-references, or places where the same word, the same phrase, a similar event, a similar place are found. And for some of you will have Bibles that have a centre margin where some of the work's been taken out of this by people that have pulled together references and collected them so that we can more quickly find them. So here's an example. In John's record, it's talking about the question that was actually put to John the Baptist, and the people ask him, "Are you the prophet?" And then say, "Well, why did they ask such a specific question of John? Why would they use that term?" And we can find that out by linking it to where they were referring to in their scriptures. And that can be done. You can see here, just to show you how it works. This is in verse 21, and across here, verse 21, you've got a little A down the bottom there next to the prophet. And the A there says that comes from Deuteronomy chapter 18, verses 15 and 18. So we can use these cross-references or linkages to say, oh, okay, they were actually quoting from that their own scriptures in that location. So that's an example. There's other examples that show the links between the Old Testament and the New Testament, and that's really important because it's they are in fact linked, and it's very important, as we've said previously, to understand God's message that's consistent through both of the Old and the New Testaments. And for example, we might know that, and we just talked about the angel Gabriel and the words to Mary. Talks about the throne of David in Luke chapter 1, and when we look it up in our Bible with the cross-reference, Luke chapter 1 verse 32, there on the screen, and we can see that it says that that Jesus will sit on the throne of his father David. and we can find the linkage to that. Where did that come from in the Old Testament by looking at the reference, which here, again, verse 32, item C, the little C there. Go down here to verse 32, and the reference here to the C comes to 2 Samuel chapter 7. Okay, so that's the prophecy that was given to King David, where it tells him that that Jesus would come and that he would eventually sit on his throne. So that's another example of how cross references can be very useful. They can also be used to work out details on who a person might be talking about. For example, in Hebrews chapter 5, there's a character referred to as Melchizedek. And we say, oh, that's an interesting name. Where does that come from? And what's that all about? And so we can use the cross-reference in that situation to see that it's actually referred to in Psalm 110 and way back in Genesis chapter 14. And it helps to find out information about people and places. And look, there's all sorts of books that talk to us about this sort of thing. I've got an example here, which is the Treasury of Scripture Knowledge, and it's just a book that is full of cross references for every verse of the Bible. So it's actually not a Bible; it's actually a margin very much expanded for the whole Bible. So there's all sorts of helps that are available, and I think they're online as well. So here's an example where we can use them to fill in details of parallel accounts. So, for example, Jesus gave a prophecy on the Mount of Olives, and in Luke chapter 21, it says they asked him a question in verse 7. And you say, oh, who was that? Who was asking the question? And and Luke doesn't say, there's no details there, it just says they asked him a question. But if we go to the cross-reference in Matthew 24, which is exactly the same prophecy in a parallel record, it tells us that it was the disciples that asked the question. And then we go further and go to the Mark record in Mark chapter 13, and it specifically says which disciples it is. That is, it was Peter, James, John, and Andrew. And that's an example of how you can fill in the picture. You can, by looking at parallel accounts, we can get a much richer picture of what was going on. And that sort of thing can also be done, looking at the parallel accounts, for example, of the kings of Israel and Judah. There's a king recorded in 2 Kings chapter 21, King Manasseh, and basically all it says is that he was an evil man. He did evil in the sight of the Lord. That's the sum total of the record. But if we compare that then with the cross-reference to 2 Chronicles 33, it also gives a bit more detail. It says that he did evil, but he repented. So by building a bigger picture of this, we can understand more about the character. Here's another example, and this will be our final one for tonight. I'm mindful we've started a bit late, so we're running pretty much to time. So Jesus was preaching in Samaria, which is an interesting section in John chapter 4, John's Gospel record, and it actually gives some detail about it. It says that he was in a city of Samaria called Sychar, on a plot of ground that Jacob gave to his son Joseph. Now that's a bit of detail, and we can go through the using the tools that Matt's described, and it will help us understand that it's talking about a place called Shechem in the Hebrew. And when we go to the record where that comes from in Joshua chapter 24, we find out that, and here's where sort of it starts to become really interesting. In Joshua 24, Joshua was in exactly the same place that Jesus was in, and and you just heard Matt explaining how Jesus and Joshua have the same name, and in verse 14 of Joshua 24, it says there, and Joshua is giving his final message to the people, and he says to the people that they need to fear God and serve him with sincerity and truth. Basically put away all of the false gods and turn to the true God and worship. And then we sort of link that to John chapter 4, which is where it sort of makes a particular point about where Jesus was giving this message to the woman in John chapter 4. And it turns out that he uses the same expression. He says that that they need to, because they had a mixed worship in that area, and Jesus essentially says to the woman that you need to worship in spirit and truth. And so you can see that Jesus and Joshua are using the same words in the same place, thousands of years apart. Now, you would not, unless you do a bit of digging, you would not pick up that sort of detail and richness in the record. So it just gives you some an indication, if you like, of how fascinating Bible study can be when all of this detail is hidden in there for us to search out and make beautiful connections. So that's our session for tonight. And next week we're going to be talking about versions of the Bible. We're going to look at archaeology, as mentioned. We're going to look at the Bible and modern medicine and the purpose of God revealed. So that's the end of it for tonight. Over to you if there's any question.